January 14, 1945. 5 kilometers west of Houffalize, Belgium. Frozen mud crunches beneath Sergeant Frank Kozlowski's boots as he swings open the rear doors of the M1937 field kitchen trailer, releasing a cloud of steam that rises like a ghost into the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature hovers at 6 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath crystallizes instantly. But inside that rolling metal box, coffee boils at a furious bubble, and the smell of scrambled powdered eggs and pork sausages cuts through the bitter Ardennes winter like a promise. "Third platoon's 2 minutes out," Corporal Danny Hayes yells from his post by the camouflage netting. You can hear the rumble of boots now, dozens of them, as Charlie Company's forward elements emerge from the tree line. They've been on patrol since 0200 hours. Their faces are gray masks of exhaustion and cold. Some haven't slept in 36 hours. Kozlowski ladles steaming coffee into the first canteen cup thrust toward him. The soldier holding it, Private First Class Martinez, Kentucky accent thick as molasses, doesn't say thank you. He just wraps both hands around the metal cup and closes his eyes. "Keep the line moving," Kozlowski barks. But there's no real edge to it. He's been doing this since Normandy, June through January. 7 months of feeding men who are expected to kill or be killed day after day in conditions that would break civilians like dry kindling. The field kitchen crew works with mechanical precision. Hayes on coffee, Private Lewis on eggs, Kozlowski himself handling the sausages and managing the flow. The M1937 kitchen trailer is a marvel of American industrial engineering. Towed behind a 2.5-ton truck, it carries 2 gasoline burners, water tanks, and enough provisions to serve hot meals to 200 men 3 times daily. The 28th Infantry Division's Quartermaster Corps has positioned 3 of these units in rotation, leapfrogging forward as the front advances, ensuring that no soldier goes more than 6 hours without access to hot food. Across the line, in the German positions dug into the frozen hills 3 kilometers east, Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich gnaws on a piece of black bread so hard it might as well be tree bark. The bread is 5 days old. It arrived in a supply truck that also brought 12 rounds of artillery ammunition and nothing else. No meat, no coffee, no warmth. Dietrich's squad shares 1 small tin of liverwurst among 7 men. They melt snow for water. Their last hot meal was 4 days ago, before the American counteroffensive began in earnest. Dietrich doesn't know about the American field kitchens yet. He will. Back at the American position, First Lieutenant Robert Chen appears from the command post tent, his map case tucked under one arm. He accepts a cup of coffee from Kozlowski and stands watching his men eat. This is part of his ritual. Every morning he watches them receive hot food, watches the transformation. You can see it happen in real time. Shoulders straighten, conversations begin, someone laughs. These are men who have been fighting through the bloodiest winter campaign in the European theater. And yet here they stand, eating eggs and sausage off metal trays like it's a Saturday morning at a diner in Ohio. "How's the fuel situation?" Chen asks. "We're good through tomorrow noon," Kozlowski replies. "Resupply convoys scheduled for 1,400 hours today." Chen nods. The fuel isn't just for the trucks and tanks. It's for the burners, for the heat, for the coffee that keeps men alert enough to spot a German sniper before the sniper spots them. The Army has calculated this down to the gallon. Morale equals effectiveness, and hot food equals morale. It's simple mathematics written in steam and calories. A jeep skids to a halt near the kitchen, and Captain Morris from S2 Intelligence climbs out. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge," he tells Chen. "Looks like a company-strength probe. Maybe they're testing our lines." Chen drains his coffee. Tell the men to finish eating and get to their positions. The order ripples through the line. Men wolf down their remaining food, refill their canteens with hot coffee, and move toward their foxholes with the kind of urgency that comes from experience. Within 4 minutes, the area around the field kitchen is empty, except for the crew. Kozlowski begins breaking down the serving station. The kitchen will displace 500 meters north within the hour, staying just behind the main line of resistance, always mobile, always ready. In the German positions, Dietrich finishes his bread and wipes the crumbs from his coat. His stomach growls. He hasn't felt truly full in 3 weeks. He doesn't know it yet, but in 72 hours, he'll surrender to an American patrol. And the first thing they'll give him is coffee so hot it burns his tongue, and so delicious he'll think he's dreaming. January 16, 1945. Eastern Ridge above Houffalize. The German defensive position is a masterwork of desperation. Trenches carved into frozen earth. Machine gun nests concealed beneath snow-covered pine branches. And men who look less like soldiers and more like scarecrows wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich crouches in his foxhole, sharing body heat with Gefreiter Klaus Becker, a former university student from Leipzig who hasn't stopped shivering in 6 days. "When did you last eat?" Becker asks, his voice barely audible over the wind. Dietrich has to think about it. "Yesterday morning, half a potato." The potato had been frozen solid. They'd held it over a candle flame until it was soft enough to chew. No salt, no butter. Just the mealy, gray flesh of a vegetable that had survived in a supply depot somewhere behind the lines, before finally reaching the front. The candle had been precious too. Light discipline meant using it was a risk. But hunger makes men take risks. You need to understand what's happening to the German army in January 1945. The Wehrmacht that conquered Poland in weeks and France in months is a ghost. The supply lines that once stretched efficiently from Berlin to the Atlantic have collapsed under relentless Allied bombing. Trains don't run on schedule anymore. Trucks have no fuel. Horses, yes, the German army still relies heavily on horses, are dying of starvation themselves. Their carcasses butchered for meat, when artillery shells aren't landing close enough to make butchering impossible. Lieutenant Friedrich Vogel, commander of Dietrich's platoon, makes his rounds through the positions. He's 23 years old, but looks 40. His greatcoat hangs loose on a frame that's lost 15 kilograms since December. He stops at each foxhole, offers what encouragement he can, though his words sound hollow even to himself. "Supply convoy tonight," Vogel tells Dietrich's position. "Bread, sausage, maybe some cigarettes." Dietrich nods but doesn't believe it. They've been promised supply convoys before. Sometimes they arrive, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they arrive but contain only ammunition, which you cannot eat, though Dietrich has heard stories of men so hungry they tried. Across the valley, invisible in the morning fog, the Americans are eating breakfast. Dietrich can't see them, can't smell the food. But if he could, the contrast would break something inside him. The U.S. Army has established a logistical chain so sophisticated that it can deliver not just hot food, but variety. Scrambled eggs, pancakes with syrup, bacon, sausage, coffee with real sugar, bread that's soft and white. The American quartermasters treat food with the same seriousness they treat ammunition. This isn't accident. This is doctrine. In 1943, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps conducted extensive studies on combat effectiveness and determined that hot meals improved soldier performance by measurable percentages. Men who ate hot food could march farther, shoot straighter, and resist combat fatigue longer than men subsisting on cold rations. So the Army invested in mobile kitchens, in supply chains, in the unglamorous but essential infrastructure of feeding an army in the field. The Germans made different calculations. They assumed speed and aggression would end the war before logistics mattered. They assumed conquered territories would feed their troops. They assumed many things that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Now Dietrich sits in a frozen hole eating nothing, while a kilometer away, Private Martinez from Kentucky scrapes the last of his scrambled eggs off his tray and considers whether he has room for another cup of coffee. Becker speaks again, quieter now. My brother wrote me before Christmas. He's in a stalag in Poland, guarding Russian prisoners. He says they're starving. He says the guards are almost as hungry as the prisoners. Dietrich says nothing. What is there to say? The entire Eastern Front is starving. The Western Front is starving. Germany itself is starving, though the officers don't talk about it. You can see it in the faces of the replacements when they arrive from the rear. Hollow-cheeked boys who look like they've never had a full meal in their lives. A distant rumble echoes across the valley. Artillery, but far enough away that it's not their immediate problem. Dietrich knows the sound intimately now. The American guns firing in preparation for another advance. The shells will fall, the earth will shake, and then the infantry will come, well-fed and equipped, pushing forward another few hundred meters. I heard something, Becker says suddenly, from a captured American we interrogated last week, before they took him to the rear. What did you hear? He said the Americans get hot food every day, every single day, even on the front line. They have trucks with kitchens inside them. Dietrich snorts. Propaganda. That's what the lieutenant said. But the Americans seemed surprised we didn't believe him. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. Dietrich shifts position, trying to restore circulation to his numb feet. Trucks with kitchens inside them. Hot food every day. It sounds like a fantasy. Like the stories his grandmother used to tell about magical lands where rivers ran with milk and honey. But in 72 hours, Hans Dietrich will learn that some fantasies are real. January 18th, 1945. 0430 hours. The American artillery barrage begins with a sound like the earth splitting open. Hans Dietrich presses himself into the bottom of his foxhole as shells scream overhead and detonate along the German line in eruptions of frozen dirt, shattered pine trees, and white phosphorus that burns bright enough to read by. The barrage lasts 14 minutes. When it stops, the ringing in Dietrich's ears is so loud he almost doesn't hear Lieutenant Vogel shouting for status reports. Sector 3, Dietrich yells back, his voice raw. Becker and I are alive. But when he looks to his left, the foxhole where Corporal Zimmerman and Private Schultz had been dug in is simply gone, replaced by a crater still smoking in the pre-dawn darkness. Dietrich tastes bile. He's seen this before, he'll see it again. The American infantry comes 40 minutes later, advancing through the morning fog in squad-sized elements with excellent spacing and fire discipline. These aren't the green replacements the Germans faced in November. These are veterans of the Hurtgen Forest and the Bulge, men who know their trade. Dietrich fires his Kar 98K until the barrel is hot enough to steam, but there are too many of them, and they're advancing from 3 directions. Fall back! Vogel's command cuts through the chaos. Fighting withdrawal to the secondary line. Dietrich grabs Becker's arm and they scramble out of the foxhole, running in a crouch through trees that provide concealment but not cover. You learn the difference fast in combat. Concealment hides you, cover stops bullets. Pine trees only offer the first. Behind them, American voices coordinate in English. Words Dietrich doesn't understand, but whose meaning is clear. They're flanking the German position. The withdrawal becomes a rout within 20 minutes. Dietrich's platoon, already under strength, fragments into isolated groups trying to reach an assembly point that may no longer exist. Dietrich and Becker find themselves in a shallow ravine with 3 other soldiers, none of whom Dietrich recognizes. They're from a different company, separated from their unit. Where's the secondary line? One of them asks. He's barely 18, his eyes wide with panic. Nobody answers because nobody knows. That's when they hear the American voices again, closer now, moving along both sides of the ravine. Dietrich realizes with sick certainty that they're cut off. He looks at Becker, sees the same understanding in his friend's face. They have perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether they live or die. "We can't fight 5 against a platoon," Becker whispers. One of the other soldiers, older, a veteran, nods slowly. "I have no ammunition left anyway." Dietrich checks his own pouches. 4 rounds remaining. 4 bullets against what sounds like at least 20 Americans moving through the woods above them. The mathematics are brutal and simple. The older soldier stands slowly, hands raising above the edge of the ravine. "Nicht schießen," he calls out. "Don't shoot." Then, in broken English, "We surrender. No weapons." The American voices stop moving. There's a moment of terrible silence where anything could happen, where a nervous trigger finger could end all of them. Then a voice with a thick Boston accent responds, "Come out slow, hands on your heads. Anyone tries anything, and you're all dead." Dietrich stands. His legs feel like water. This is it. After 2 years on the Eastern Front, 6 months in the West, countless battles and skirmishes and bombardments, this is how his war ends. Standing up out of a ravine with his hands on his head, surrendering to the Americans. They climb out one by one. 6 American soldiers surround them, rifles raised, fingers on triggers. A sergeant, Dietrich can read the stripes, approaches cautiously. He's perhaps 30, with a hard face softened slightly by eyes that have seen enough killing to be tired of it. "Any of you speak English?" the sergeant asks. "Little," Becker says. "Small English." "You armed?" Becker slowly reaches for his Luger, removes it with 2 fingers, and places it on the ground. The others do the same. Dietrich adds his Kar 98K to the pile. The Americans relax slightly, though their weapons never waver. "Search them," the sergeant orders. Rough hands pat down Dietrich's coat, remove his paybook, a letter from his mother, a photograph of his sister. The American soldier examining these items shows them to the sergeant, who glances at them and nods. "These are soldiers, not SS. The distinction matters." "You boys are lucky," the sergeant says to Becker, who seems to understand more English than the others. "Caught you before Lieutenant Chen's platoon did. Those boys lost half their squad yesterday. They're not in a taking prisoners mood." Becker translates quietly. Dietrich feels a cold that has nothing to do with the weather. They are, indeed, lucky. He's heard the stories about what happens when men are too angry, too traumatized, too far beyond the reach of civilization. "Move out," the sergeant orders. "Back to the collection point." They march west, away from the fighting, hands still on their heads. The sounds of battle fade behind them. Dietrich's stomach cramps with hunger so intense it's painful. He stumbles once, catches himself, keeps walking. After 30 minutes, they reach an American position in a cleared area surrounded by foxholes and camouflage netting. There are perhaps 20 other German prisoners already here, sitting on the frozen ground under guard. And then Dietrich smells it. Coffee, real coffee, and cooking meat. His head swims. It must be for the Americans, obviously, but the smell alone is almost too much to bear. A field kitchen sits 50 meters away, and soldiers are lined up receiving food. Hot food. Steam rising into the cold morning air. An American lieutenant approaches the new prisoners. "Anyone wounded?" he asks in passable German. Nobody responds. They're all too stunned by the smell of food. The lieutenant sighs. "Get them some coffee and rations. They look half dead." Dietrich doesn't understand the English. But 5 minutes later, an American soldier hands him a canteen cup filled with coffee so hot he nearly drops it. Another soldier gives him a chocolate bar. Hans Dietrich, Obergefreiter in the Wehrmacht, veteran of Kursk and the Bulge, stares at the chocolate bar in his hand and begins to cry. January 18th, 1945. 1100 hours. The prisoner collection point has grown to hold 63 German soldiers, and Captain William Morrison from the 28th Infantry Division's intelligence section moves among them with a translator, conducting preliminary interrogations. Morrison is 34, a former history professor from Michigan who speaks fluent German and understands that intelligence gathering is as much about reading faces as listening to words. Hans Dietrich sits on the ground, the chocolate bar wrapper still in his pocket because he can't quite believe it was real and needs the physical evidence. His stomach is full for the first time in 2 weeks. After the coffee and chocolate, the Americans brought bread, canned stew, and more coffee. Hot food served without ceremony, as if feeding enemy prisoners were the most natural thing in the world. Morrison crouches beside Dietrich and his group. "I'm Captain Morrison," he says in perfect German. "I need to ask you some questions. Your name and rank?" "Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, 3rd Company, 326th Volksgrenadier Division." Morrison writes this down. "How long has your unit been in this sector?" "Since January 9th. We moved up from reserve." "What were your ration levels?" The question catches Dietrich off guard. He expected queries about troop positions, about defensive plans, about artillery placements. Instead, the American wants to know about food. "Inadequate," Dietrich answers carefully. "We received bread every 2nd day, sometimes 3rd day. Occasionally meat. No hot meals for the past week." Morrison's pen scratches across his notepad. "And before you moved to this sector?" Dietrich hesitates, then decides honesty costs him nothing now. "In reserve, we had 1 hot meal every 3 days, sometimes soup. The supply situation is difficult." "Difficult," Morrison repeats. He glances toward the American field kitchen, where Sergeant Kozlowski is already preparing the midday meal for the forward units. "What did you think when you smelled our kitchen?" Dietrich meets the captain's eyes. "I thought it was a dream, or a trick." "A trick?" "We were told the Americans were suffering too, that your supply lines were overextended, that you were running out of food and fuel." Dietrich gestures toward the field kitchen, toward the American soldiers moving with the easy confidence of well-fed men. "This is not what we were told." Morrison nods slowly. This is what he came to understand. Not troop movements, those change daily, but the psychological reality, the morale differential that determines which army can sustain offensive operations, and which army is slowly starving into defeat. Klaus Becker, sitting beside Dietrich, speaks up. His English is better than Dietrich realized. "Every day?" he asks Morrison. "You get hot food every day?" "Most days, yes. The field kitchens rotate to ensure every frontline unit receives at least 1 hot meal daily, often 2. Becker shakes his head in disbelief. "We thought the prisoner we interrogated was lying. He said the same thing." "What prisoner?" "Last week, an American corporal we captured during a patrol. He told us about mobile kitchens, about hot food at the front. Our officers said it was propaganda, that he was trying to damage our morale." Morrison writes furiously, "What else did your officers tell you about American capabilities?" The conversation continues for 20 minutes, and Morrison begins to understand the full scope of German miscalculation. It's not just that they underestimated American industrial capacity or logistical sophistication. They fundamentally misunderstood what it means to feed an army in modern warfare. The Germans still think of food as fuel, calories to keep men moving. The Americans understand it as a weapon, a tool for sustaining morale, for reinforcing the message that the army takes care of its soldiers, for proving through the simple act of serving hot meals that victory is inevitable because an army that can feed its men this well cannot be defeated. You can see it in the prisoners' faces. They're not just defeated. They're psychologically overwhelmed by the gap between what they were promised and what they've encountered. They expected desperate Americans clinging to overextended supply lines. Instead, they found an army eating scrambled eggs and drinking real coffee on the front line. Lieutenant Robert Chen joins Morrison, carrying a clipboard with preliminary intelligence summaries. "Sir, we've processed 40 of them. Same story across the board. Low rations, poor resupply, collapsing morale. Most of them surrendered because they saw no point in fighting for another day or two of frozen bread." Morrison stands, his knees cracking. "Get this to division. They need to understand how fragile the German position is. It's not just tactical weakness. They're starving." Chen nods and heads toward the communications tent. Morrison looks back at Dietrich and Becker, at the other prisoners sitting in small groups, some still eating the rations they've been given, others simply staring at the field kitchen as if it's a miracle. Dietrich catches Morrison's gaze. "May I ask a question, Captain?" "Go ahead." "Why feed us? We are prisoners. You could give us nothing." Morrison considers how to answer. "Because the Geneva Convention requires it," he says finally, "and because we can afford to, and because—" He pauses, searching for the right words. "Because this is how we fight. We take care of our people, and that includes prisoners. It's not charity. It's who we are." Dietrich nods slowly, processing this. In the Wehrmacht, in the desperate struggle on the Eastern Front, such philosophy would be incomprehensible. You fight with what you have until you have nothing left, and then you fight with even less. The idea that an army would invest resources in prisoner welfare, that it would demonstrate abundance rather than hoarding scarcity, represents a worldview so foreign it might as well be from another planet. But here it is, proven in coffee and chocolate and hot stew. "How long until the war ends?" Becker asks quietly. Morrison shakes his head. "That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. You made the right choice surrendering. Whatever happens now, you'll be warm and fed. It's a small comfort, perhaps. But as Dietrich sits on frozen ground, holding an empty canteen cup that still smells of coffee, it feels like more mercy than this war has offered in a very long time. March 7, 1945. POW interrogation facility, Rushims, France. Hans Dietrich sits across a wooden table from a U.S. Army psychologist named Major Eleanor Barrett, who is conducting a study on prisoner morale and combat effectiveness for the War Department. 7 weeks have passed since his capture. Dietrich has gained back the weight he lost in January and more. His uniform, cleaned and deloused, fits properly again. His color is good. He looks like a soldier rather than a scarecrow. "Tell me about the moment you decided to surrender," Barrett says in careful German, her notebook open. Dietrich has told this story before, to Captain Morrison, to other interrogators, to fellow prisoners in the camp. But each time he understands it slightly differently. "We were out of ammunition and surrounded. The tactical situation was impossible." "But you'd been in impossible situations before, yes? On the Eastern Front?" "Yes." "So what made this different?" Dietrich thinks carefully. "On the Eastern Front, we knew the Russians would kill us if we surrendered. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always certainly. So you fought until you died, or until you somehow survived. There was no third option." He pauses. "With the Americans, there was a third option, and I think we knew it before we were even captured." "What do you mean?" "Rumors, stories from other units, men who said the Americans treated prisoners according to the conventions, that they shared their rations, that they had medical care. We didn't entirely believe it. but the possibility existed in a way it never did in the East. Barrett writes this down. She's interviewed 60 former German soldiers, and a pattern has emerged. The ones captured on the Western Front speak about their surrender with a kind of relief, even gratitude. They describe American abundance, the food, the supplies, the casual waste of resources that would have sustained a German unit for weeks. Not with resentment, but with awe. It's breaking something in them, some fundamental belief about the war's righteousness or Germany's inevitable victory. You mentioned food in your initial interrogation, Barrett continues. You said the hot meals shocked you more than anything else. Because it proved everything we'd been told was a lie. Dietrich's voice carries no anger, just statement of fact. We were told the Americans were weak, soft, dependent on materiel because they lacked fighting spirit. But an army that can feed its soldiers hot meals on the front line isn't weak. It's overwhelmingly strong. Strong enough that it doesn't need to choose between ammunition and food. It can have both. This is the insight that Barrett has been gathering across dozens of interviews. The German military, for all its tactical sophistication and battlefield prowess, made a fatal strategic error. It treated logistics as a necessary evil rather than a decisive weapon. The Americans understood that modern war is won not just with bullets and bombs, but with the entire industrial and organizational capacity to sustain armies in the field indefinitely. You can teach soldiers to shoot. You can drill them in tactics. You can inspire them with ideology. But if they're starving, if they watch the enemy eating hot meals while they gnaw frozen bread, something breaks that no amount of tactical skill can repair. Across the facility, in the camp mess hall, other German prisoners line up for lunch. The Americans feed them twice daily, hot meals prepared in the same kitchens that feed American soldiers, served in quantities that would have seemed impossible luxury 6 months ago. Some prisoners have taken to volunteering for kitchen duty, fascinated by the American system, by the careful accounting of rations and the efficient distribution. Klaus Becker is among them. He works alongside American cooks now, learning their methods, asking questions in his improving English. Sergeant Kozlowski rotated to this assignment after his unit advanced beyond the Rhine, supervises the German workers with bemused patience. Why so much food? Becker asks him one day. Kozlowski shrugs. Because we've got it, and because a well-fed prisoner doesn't cause trouble. It's practical, unromantic, thoroughly American. Everything reduced to logistics and efficiency. But beneath the pragmatism, Becker senses something else. A confidence so deep it doesn't need to announce itself. The Americans feed their prisoners well because they can, because their supply chains stretch back to factories and farms that weren't bombed, that operate at full capacity, that produce more than enough for both soldiers and prisoners and civilians. Germany has none of this. Germany's factories are rubble. Its farms are worked by old men and children. Its supply lines are strangled by Allied air power. The gap between what Germany can sustain and what America can project is not a gap. It's a chasm. Later that day, Dietrich walks the perimeter of the camp, not attempting escape. Where would he go? But simply taking exercise in the weak March sun. He thinks about the war, about the men still fighting in the collapsing Reich, about the difference between dying for a cause and simply dying because surrender isn't possible. He thinks about that morning in January, about the smell of American coffee cutting through frozen air, about the moment he understood that everything he'd been told about the enemy was propaganda constructed to hide an unbearable truth. Germany was going to lose because it had already lost, because the industrial and organizational power arrayed against it was so vast that tactical victories meant nothing. The field kitchens were just a symbol, but symbols matter. They told a story more powerful than any propaganda broadcast, more convincing than any speech. They said, "We are so strong we can afford to feed you. We are so confident we don't need to hoard. We are so certain of victory that we treat even our enemies with a casual generosity that you could never match." On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally. Hans Dietrich hears the news in the POW camp near Reims. Some prisoners weep, others sit in silence. Dietrich feels mostly relief. It's over. The killing, the dying, the slow starvation of an entire nation. Over. He'll remain a prisoner until December 1945, then return to a Germany he barely recognizes, devastated and divided. But he'll survive, he'll rebuild, and for the rest of his life, when people ask him about the war, he'll tell them about many things: the battles, the fear, the camaraderie. But he'll always come back to one moment, one smell, one revelation that crystallized everything. The smell of American coffee on a frozen January morning, and the understanding that the war was already lost. The end